Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Today, we're
Mhm.
going to be looking at a really heartbreaking story.
Yeah.
It comes to us from Valencia, Spain,
Oh, wow.
where a devastating flood has unfortunately claimed many lives.
No, it's really sad.
What makes this story even more thought-provoking, though, is the public's reaction to the tragedy,
Yeah.
particularly the anger directed at King Felipe VI.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Almost like
Yeah.
a natural disaster has collided with political tension.
Right, yeah.
And it's revealing a lot about the relationship between the Spanish people
Yeah.
and their leaders.
And the monarchy.
Our main source today is an article from The Independent.
Okay.
It's titled, Spain Floods Latest. Furious crowds chant murderer and toss mud at King Felipe in crisis-hit Valencia visit.
Wow.
At least 217 people have died in this flood.
Oh, my goodness.
This makes it Spain's worst flood-related disaster in recent history.
Yeah, I can't remember anything like this.
And you know,
So many people.
sadly, that number is expected to rise as rescue efforts continue.
Yeah, that's the thing with
Yeah.
these events. Often the
Yeah.
death toll keeps climbing as they
Right.
find more people.
So the king and queen,
Mm-hmm.
alongside the prime minister, went to Valencia to meet with officials,
Okay.
emergency responders, and those directly affected by the flood.
So standard visit.
A standard visit,
Yeah.
kind of to show support and solidarity.
Right.
But the situation took a dramatic turn when they were met with this huge crowd
Yeah.
of just furious residents.
I read about this.
It wasn't quiet discontent.
Yeah.
It was like raw anger and grief,
Uh-huh.
like just shouting, mud throwing.
Oh, wow.
The police were on horseback trying to manage the escalating chaos.
It sounds like a scene out of a movie.
It does.
Yeah.
And then the article even mentions people shouting murderer at the king.
Oh, wow.
Like that's not something.
That's not something you hear every day,
No, especially.
especially directed at a monarch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think is fueling this level of outrage?
Well, it's complex.
Yeah.
I think
Like what's at the heart of it?
a lot of residents are saying that the alerts about the storm and potential flooding were very delayed.
So like they were caught off guard.
Totally. Yeah, they felt blindsided.
Wow.
And that's only compounded by the perception that the government's emergency response was very slow and inadequate.
Yeah.
So it's this feeling of abandonment from the
Yeah.
very institutions that are supposed to protect them.
And the article quotes one young man who was confronting the king and saying, it was known and nobody did anything to avoid it.
Wow.
You can just hear the desperation and anger
Yeah.
in his voice.
Like they had information and didn't act on it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another woman told the queen, we don't have any water.
Oh, gosh.
So these stories put a human face on the tragedy,
Yeah.
but they also underscore the level of desperation
Yeah.
that people are experiencing.
Absolutely.
And then there's the Bonaire shopping center car park,
Oh.
which is completely submerged.
Mm-hmm.
And there are fears that many people who sought refuge there are now trapped and deceased.
Gosh, that's awful.
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
The article shares the story of Eduardo Martinez,
Hmm.
who was a worker at the shopping center,
Okay.
and he chose to sleep in the cinema rather than risk driving home.
Interesting.
It makes you wonder how many others might have ignored, like the security guard's warnings,
Right.
and drove into the rising water,
Yeah, thinking they would be safe.
hoping to find safety.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just a natural disaster.
right.
It seems like a confluence of factors,
Yeah.
potentially including failures in communication and response,
Yeah, like a perfect storm.
that magnified this tragedy.
Right, and that's really what we want to unpack,
Right.
Could this have been prevented?
Right.
Was the government's response sufficient?
Mm-hmm.
And why is the public directing so much anger at the king?
Right. Like what's
Yeah.
going on?
What's at the heart of it?
Yeah.
Let's dive deeper into these questions.
Yeah. Let's get into it.
Okay. I think this tragedy in Valencia has brought to light some big questions about what the government should be doing
Yeah.
and what people expect during these crises.
You're right. It's easy to just point fingers and blame after a disaster,
Totally.
but it's important to understand the complexities of it all.
Absolutely. Let's start with preparedness.
Okay.
Spain's had its fair share of flooding in the past.
Right.
You would assume they'd have a good system in place
You would think. Yeah.
to mitigate the impact of these events.
But the public anger suggests maybe there are some holes in the system.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's where I think the anger at King Felipe comes in. he's kind of become a symbol of those failures.
Okay.
He represents the government,
The establishment.
the authority that people feel like has let them down.
So, like, he's become the scapegoat,
A lightning rod for their grief and frustration.
even if he's not directly responsible.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that in times of crisis, people look for someone to blame.
Right.
And in this case, it's King Felipe, even if he wasn't the one making the decisions.
Right.
Yeah.
And the article did mention that despite all this, the king remained pretty calm.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And tried to talk to people.
Even with mud being thrown.
Even as mud was being thrown at him.
Wow.
It was like he was trying to engage with people.
Yeah.
Showing concern. But who knows if that's enough to win back their trust.
Right. It seems like there's this deep sense of disillusionment and lack of faith in their government.
Yeah. Their response, or lack thereof, has really shaken people's confidence.
And I think this goes beyond the floods. This could have long-term consequences for their political landscape.
Right.
The people are going to demand answers,
Accountability.
and they're going to want to see real changes.
So prevent this from happening again.
Exactly.
So it sounds like this flood has kind of become this catalyst for this bigger conversation.
Right.
About the government and their responsibility.
Disaster preparedness.
The relationship between the people and their leaders.
You got it. This is a wake-up call, not just for Spain,
But for everyone.
for every nation facing climate change and needing to be prepared for disasters.
So what are the key takeaways here?
Okay, well, first...
What can we learn? It shows how important those early warning systems are.
Yeah.
Like if they had gotten those alerts sooner, they might have had time to evacuate and maybe some lives could have been saved.
That makes sense. What else?
It also really underscores the need for a fast emergency response.
Okay.
People need to know that their government can act quickly when there's a crisis.
And that means having the resources and a plan to get help to the people who need it most.
Exactly. And lastly, this event shows how important transparency and accountability are.
Okay.
People need to feel like their leaders are being honest with them.
Especially during a crisis.
Especially during a crisis, they need to own up to mistakes and make a plan to fix things and rebuild trust.
So this deep dive has really shown us that this flood is way more than a natural disaster. It's a political crisis that's exposed issues and highlighted that change is needed.
And it's a story that's going to continue to play out in the weeks and months and years to come.
Yeah. How Spain responds to this.
Right.
How they address people's concerns.
Yeah.
That's going to determine the impact of this tragedy in the long run.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
This has been an eye-opening deep dive.
Definitely.
It's a stark reminder that even in like developed nations, we can still improve when it comes to disaster preparedness.
You know, it's a lesson every country should really take to heart, especially as climate change gets worse. We're likely to see more of these extreme weather events.
Right.
Floods, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, you name it.
Governments all over the world need to be ready.
Yeah, they got to invest in infrastructure, develop early warning systems, and have like solid plans in place to evacuate people and provide aid.
Right. And it needs to be efficient.
Exactly. Like they have to be able to act quickly.
Yeah.
And just as important is that transparency and accountability.
Right.
People need to know that their leaders are being truthful.
Yeah.
And that they're taking responsibility.
And learning from their mistakes.
Absolutely.
You know, this whole thing in Valencia really shows how fragile that trust is and how quickly it can be lost when people feel let down.
Yeah, being a good leader isn't just about managing a crisis. It's about building up that resilience, fostering trust and making sure everyone feels safe.
Right.
Especially when times are tough.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a lot of feelings.
Yeah.
Obviously sadness for the lives lost, anger at what seemed to be failures.
Right.
But also this sense of hope.
Yeah.
That this tragedy might lead to real change.
I hope so.
Not just in Spain, but all around the world.
I agree with that sentiment.
Yeah. This event has exposed some weak points, but
it's also like an opportunity to come back stronger, to be more resilient.
And really commit to the safety and well-being of people.
Yeah.
So important.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive today.
Yeah.
It was a heavy topic.
Definitely.
But so important.
Yeah.
And we hope you keep thinking about these issues, stay informed about what's happening in Valencia, and keep talking about disaster preparedness.
And holding your leaders accountable.
Yeah, because it's through these conversations
Absolutely.
and actions that we can create a safer and more resilient future.
For everyone.
Yeah, for everyone.